Welcome on into what we call the Big Brains preview here on Fox Sports The Gambler. My name is Joe Tansey, along with Ryan Coyle. Beef, as we affectionately call him around these parts. 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks of regular season college football. It always flies by. And at this point in the season, like we always have, in past years, it's been 4 teams. In this iteration of the playoff, it's 12 teams. We're having a very, very healthy debate. Some bits nonsensical debate about what teams should get into the playoff. And if you go by the betting odds, and the betting odds only, the Tennessee Volunteers might get the short end of the stick. But a lot can happen in 2 weeks. A lot can happen in 2 weeks. There's 2 games on the schedule this week, Indiana, Ohio State, and Army Notre Dame, that have significant playoff implications. One for Indiana's sake, and the other one, I think, for Notre Dame as well. So it's going to be very fascinating to see how those 2 games play out. But let's start with this. The playoff, the rankings are out. It's to nobody's surprise the Big 12 is now really screwed, with Boise State taking over the number 4 spot in the projected bracket. And then we have Tennessee in this mishmash of 2 lost teams in the SEC. So I'll first ask you, did the SEC, that order of 4 teams, Bama, Georgia, Ole Miss, Tennessee, is it the right order?
I think it is right now. I think recency bias definitely plays, a role in this scenario. Like when you look at Ole Miss, the last thing that you remember from Ole Miss is walking off the field victorious against Georgia. When you look at Tennessee, the last thing you remember about Tennessee, walking off the field, a 2-touchdown loser to Georgia. So I think that kind of is taken into account there. But then it also goes, you can play the card of, all right, well, Ole Miss has objectively 2 worse losses. I mean, Arkansas, LSU at this point kind of is a wash, but the Kentucky loss is a lot worse, for Tennessee, I think, than the Georgia loss. But then when you look at Alabama, like, why are they all the way up at 7, I believe, right now, when they have a loss to Vanderbilt on their schedule, and then a loss at Tennessee? Like, you could say, all right, well, Tennessee beat Alabama. Tennessee should be in over them. But it's a lot of where you go back to the right when the first rankings come out, everything's going to play itself out pretty much. Like, we have 2 weeks left and we're already having the conversation of, all right, some teams are going to get screwed. One of these teams could screw themselves over the next 2 weeks and push themselves right out. There's still ball to be played. And I'm really interested to see as well, once we get to the conference title games, what that brings to the table. Like if there is a 2-loss team, that does that 3rd loss ding them that Kiffin was talking about earlier this week. So still a lot of ball to be played over these next 2 weeks, and everything's going to iron itself out, I think. But I do think there's a good chance that it gets down to like Tennessee, Ole Miss, and like Indiana. You can only take 2 out of those 3 for the at-large. That's kind of where I see it as of right now.
So then I guess the point that we're all trying to figure out is, what if it doesn't sort itself out? And look, that's a line that I've used many, many times over the last few years, is that college football has this weird way of just sorting itself out. Somebody usually falls. It's college football. There's something weird is bound to happen over these next 2 weeks. Now, I don't see it happening with Ole Miss. I don't see it happening with Tennessee, but that's kind of the glory of this sport is, what if Florida beats Ole Miss? What if Vanderbilt?
You want me to pull up the bracket? I got the bracket. Share the screen.
But what if Vanderbilt's last stand is against Tennessee at home? What if those 2 things? What if, again, it's unlikely, but what if Georgia Tech? What if that happens? So like, it's all very there's a lot of what ifs, right, with this entire situation, and there's a bunch of rivalry games baked in that maybe in previous years we didn't really think to consider, right? Because you have Tennessee, Vanderbilt, typically a one-sided game. Georgia Tech, good old-fashioned hate, typically a one-sided game. And then the Egg Bowl, which is just it, to go on a quick rant, and we'll do this next week. The Egg Bowl being Black Friday at 3:30 p.m. is the biggest crime to humanity we've ever witnessed. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. Thursday night, Thanksgiving night, all I want to do is have a nice alternative to the NFL game, and my 2 drunk cousins from Mississippi are beating the pulp out of each other, and it's the Egg Bowl is the dumbest game in the world. It is up there with one of just the dumbest rivalries in a good way in college football, where you never know what exactly is going to happen. I mean, what is it? What was it? Was it Elijah Moore who did the peeing celebration?
Yeah, the Odell pee on the dog type thing.
And that turned into what I think the dominoes of like X amount of college football jobs being like, it's like a sliding doors moment for a bunch of college football jobs because of how that game finished. But to put that at Friday at 3:30, I mean, come on, guys. I know realignment is taking a lot of things from us, but give me that on Thanksgiving night on one of the ESPN networks. It's meant for a primetime game and rant. But to get back to everything with this, we're expecting Indiana to lose. And then it becomes the whole conversation with Indiana's schedule. The schedule conversation, like, let's frankly call it what it is. It's bullshit. Because we're essentially taking Indiana because they're not part of the who's who of college football.
It's a helmet. It's a helmet factor.
Right. If you line up all the helmets, which one doesn't belong? It's Indiana. You can circle that right away. But what I think we're doing here is we're just – and ESPN is the perfect example of that because you watched 5 minutes of the ranking show last night, and they're pulling arguments out of left field that – Joey Galloway is out here saying that Curtis Work shouldn't play against Ohio State. What the hell does that even do? Because then that means Ohio State beats Indiana by like 21 points, and it kicks Indiana right on out of the playoff. Because they can't afford a loss like that. I think we can all agree to that. And then you have the comparison of what the UCLA games like meant for common opponents. Well, if you actually watch the Penn State UCLA game, Penn State dominates that entire game until UCLA scores a garbage touchdown right at the end of the game. And if you want to do common opponents, I think Washington's the other one. Well, Penn State completely dominates that one. So you have a very small factor, right, in Penn State over Indiana. But if you really look at Penn State's schedule, it's not great either. But this all comes back to one thing, and that's conference realignment. All of these arguments we're having right now about Indiana's weak schedule, Penn State's weak schedule, Ole Miss can be thrown into the fire as well. Even though they've played LSU and Georgia, look at the rest of that schedule. It's not great. But the reason we do all this, and it's also the reason why Oregon is skating right into the Big Ten championship after beating Ohio State, is because we have 18 teams in these conferences, you can't play everybody.
Yep.
And hell, you might not even play anybody for 3 or 4 years, depending on how the schedule breaks for you. So this is a product of conference realignment, and it's just kind of the new reality. So, yeah, there are going to be teams like Indiana every year now in the Big Ten and the SEC where they just catch lightning in a bottle. They're going to end up being 10, 11, and 0. We're going to sit here, complain about their schedule, and they're in the playoff. Now, we've had instances like this before. This happens plenty of times every year in college football, and I think BYU is the latest example of that. Team runs the table, gets lucky a little bit, and then finally falls off a cliff at the end. But when you look at Indiana's case, they're number 5 in the country. And now we're having a legit conversation about their schedule. This is going to happen in the 12-team playoff. Because if this is 4 teams, it takes care of itself, right? Ohio State beats Indiana, and boom, we don't talk about the Hoosiers. They go to like the Gator Bowl or whatever the Citrus Bowl is, and they have a great season, but we don't talk about them in the perspective of the 14 playoff. So I think that's the one factor, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but because realignment and the schedules have thinned everything out and the matchups can get a little diluted, this is a product of that. And it's not just Indiana, it's Ole Miss, it's Penn State, it's Texas. Of course you're not playing a ton of people, because you've stretched these conferences so thin that somebody has got to play somebody, and it's very rare that you end up with a schedule like a Georgia or even a Florida. They're not in the conversation, but they've played a lot of ranked teams where, that's going to be more of the exception to the rule than the entire trend.
It's really funny though, because like if Indiana had been in this situation last year, or you took the schedule that they have in front of them of Ohio State this week, they had Michigan, and they also had Washington on their schedule. Right. So you had the 2 teams in the national title game last year and an Ohio State team that was 11-0 going into the Michigan game. That's 3 top 5, top 10 teams on your schedule. Yeah. Indiana just got them on a bad year. Like, you could look at Georgia's schedule, and Georgia has the number one strength of schedule. But if you had Indiana playing the Washington, Michigan, and Ohio State from last year, you could rival that right with the Georgia schedule from this year, I think, to be honest. The toughest part with Georgia is their 3 toughest games are all on the road, I think. And I think that's kind of the thing that used against them. You could make an argument whether Tennessee was one of their 3 toughest games or not. But it's just like you were kind of saying with the conference realignment, it's sometimes just going to be luck of the draw. Now, they didn't do any favors themselves scheduling Charlotte, Western Illinois, and FIU in the non-con. But at the same time, they've gone out there and they've dominated each and every team they've played. Michigan's really the only team that's given them a ball game the entire season. And I just think the most kind of annoying thing is that every single video I've seen, every podcast I've listened to, every article I've read, it's like, well, Indiana's going to go and get blown out by Ohio State, and everything else will figure itself out from there. Just let them go and play the game this week before you write them off, because I think they're a team that has kind of that it factor to them. And who knows, maybe it's a tight game throughout and Ohio State just has too much talent in 60 minutes and they pull away over the last quarter. That could very well happen, but at least let them go and play the game. They're 10-0 for a reason, and they've been winning by double digits each and every week easily for a reason. They're a pretty damn good football team. Seems like the coach knows what he's doing a little bit as well. Just let things figure itself out and revisit this conversation at 3:30 or 4 on Saturday afternoon before burying Indiana right now.
So I agree with you, but we have to make predictions here.
Yeah, no, I agree. But it's just like 99% of people are just completely written.
No, I completely agree with you on that. So the hypothetical is the spread's 13 points. The odds makers are obviously not giving Indiana a chance in hell either to go into Columbus and even be competitive. So if that's the case, and you look at this game, it's a 13-point spread. What does Indiana have to do in a losing effort to be safely considered in the playoff? Because we're sitting here and we expect them with the loss, regardless of what happens, to drop into this pool of two lost teams: Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. And if we expect all 4 of those teams to win out, at least in the regular season, we're comparing them with Indiana, a one-loss Big Ten team who, according to people who think they know everything, hasn't played anybody. So if you look at this whole picture now, what does Indiana have to do? Obviously, winning would be huge. And then you could have the conversation about Ohio State.
I think Indiana, I think if Indiana wins this game, I think Indiana has the argument to not only leap Ohio State, but be the number 1 team in the country in the playoff rankings next week. I think there's a legitimate argument there for that, even over Oregon.
Ooh, maybe. But I think the Boise win for Oregon is aging so well.
Yeah, that carry a little bit more weight. But going to Columbus and winning when Oregon's win was in Eugene, I think there'd be an argument.
You could certainly put them at number 2. I would not.
They would have to be number 2.
Yeah. So can they do it?
I think that there's certainly a chance. You know, if I'm a betting man, sure, give me the plus 13 there. I think the major difference in this one, and Ohio State's center just tore his ACL, that adds another kind of wrinkle to this. But if you look at the one weak point of Ohio State's roster, I think you can say the offensive line. Indiana's defensive line has had a really good season. They lead the Big Ten in sacks and tackles for loss. I think that, kind of disruption up front could be the major difference maker. Does Will Howard, step up and make a few big plays like he did towards the end in the Ohio State game? Or does he look like the quarterback kind of in the first half that threw the pick six, was missing a few erratic throws? Indiana's a team too as well. I know coming off a bye, Cignetti's going to have them ready. And I don't think it's going to be a fearless team. I'm more so on the side of this is going to be a ball game down to the wire than Ohio State kind of dominating from start to finish. Maybe Ohio State is up 7 points and they get a late touchdown run to seal the deal. But I think Indiana for sure can make this a game. And I still think that the odds kind of reflect that even if they lose this game, if they keep it close, they're going to be in the playoffs in there at minus 450. I don't see it dropping that much if they keep this one close. But I do think if you're in the boat of Indiana finishes 11-1, this is a close loss, I would definitely take them plus the 13 rather than look at them to make the playoff there at minus 450. Because as long as they make this a game and if they don't mess up next week against Purdue. They go 11-1. I think it's going to be really hard to keep them out.
They certainly won't be slipping up against Purdue. I mean, their groundskeepers can't even do the end zones right. Indiana. So, and this is important to note with the odds, because the odds are usually baking the remaining schedule and everything kind of into account here. So they're not just, this isn't just we're looking at undefeated Indiana. They're looking at what would one loss Indiana do to get into the playoff. So you're right. It is telling that at minus 450, Indiana is sitting pretty comfortably. Meanwhile, this group of teams beneath the top 10 in odds at DraftKings Sportsbook to make the playoff, Tennessee's there at minus 135.
Yep. Significant drop-off.
Right. Whereas Ole Miss is minus 500. Georgia is minus 2,500. I think they're pretty safe at this point in the game. So if you're Tennessee, and I was tweeting this last night, if you're Tennessee, you're either rooting for Ohio State to beat the brakes off of Indiana, because then we can come out here and kind of say the similar thing to, maybe not as to the extent as BYU, but we can say, oh, Indiana a little bit fraudulent. And people will say that. That's just how this vicious cycle works.
If Indiana gets ran off the field, like it's from start to finish, not a game, I think in that scenario, you would definitely have to flip them. But as we were saying, right, let the game happen, and then we talk about whether it should be Indiana or Tennessee or even Ole Miss. Like, I think Ole Miss should be looped in that conversation. I'm sure we'll touch on that. But two games I'm definitely looking at as potential trap spots: Penn State at Minnesota, Ole Miss at Florida. Like either of those teams lose, we have a more chaos on our hands. Throw Notre Dame in the conversation as well.
And I think that's the point that everybody's making is, well, if you're Tennessee, if you're Indiana even as one-loss team, you're rooting like hell for Army or USC in the next 2 weeks to beat Notre Dame because they don't have a conference championship. They're in if they win out, and they're the one kind of X factor that we're putting in. And it's crazy because they have the worst loss of anybody across the board against Northern Illinois, but yet here they are, kind of protected by their record. And you can say the same thing about some of these other teams. But what I'm also interested in is the ACC and the Big 12 now, right? Because it's very clear they're one-bid leagues. The Big 12, although exciting, doesn't really rate in the eyes of the rankings makers. And you can see that because Colorado, very exciting, probably, I would have to argue, one of the top 10 teams in the country. They're ranked 16th, and they have to win out. They have to win the Big 12 championship game to even remotely have a sniff at this, which is kind of a shame because I look at the college football playoff, and yes, this is run by the Big 10 and the SEC, and it always will be from this point on. Mm-hmm. But Colorado has the best individual player in the country in Travis Hunter. They have, whether you like Shedeur Sanders or not, he's a top 10 draft prospect. You have the most engaging coaching personality out there. And the team's pretty damn good. They've improved on their weaknesses from last year, and they can't even sniff a move up into the top 15. And they've been playing really good ball over the last few weeks. So that right there tells you the Big 12 is a one-bid league, and there's a chance Boise State might not have to play in the quarterfinals, and then they get right into the quarters. So what do we make of the Big 12? This kind of goes into this week's games. BYU, it's hard to use the fraud word, but kind of feels that way, the way people are talking about them. And now they're, I believe, a 3-point dog at Arizona State this week, and they're plus 330 now to make the playoff, which, oh, by the way, Arizona State is only plus 380 to make the playoff.
Arizona State wins the next two they're in.
Right. And then you have Colorado. Man, I still think they're the best team in the Big 12. The odds suggest that they're minus 120 to make the playoff.
But only a 3-point favorite at Kansas this week. A 4-6 Kansas team.
Kansas team that just beat BYU, a Kansas team that was incredibly competitive with Kansas State, a Kansas team that beat Iowa State. So what do we make of the Big 12? What are the lines telling us here? Look, I'm going to blindly bet Colorado. I think they've been incredibly strong, and look, Kansas's strong suit is the quarterback play, and they've been playing really good defense, but some of these Big 12 teams have been found out. BYU, Iowa State, even Kansas State to an extent. I would be more inclined, and because BYU is the underdog, it's not much of a surprise here, but I'd be more inclined to bet Colorado and Arizona State in these two spots because Arizona State, for me, is the most underrated team in the entire country. And they've come really out of nowhere. Cam Scatterbu, one of the most electric running backs in the country. Kenny Dillingham has done a phenomenal job. And think of where ASU was after Herm Edwards left. It was quite a big mess.
Yep.
And the fact that he's come in there and turned things around and they're 2 wins away from a conference championship game is really insane. And it's a credit to the coaching job he's done. I think they beat BYU. I think Colorado beats Kansas. I don't think you can read into the lines as much as you want, but I think that's the way you kind of have to lean on those games.
I'm going to go the opposite. I'm going with Kansas,
I love it.
And I'm going with BYU. Colorado over this 4-game win streak, and I think you said it best. I think they are, like, top to bottom, the best team in the Big 12, but I also don't think there's some bulletproof team. Like, I think we see it with the projected spread between Ohio State, BYU right now in the Big 12 or the 12 versus 5 game in the first round of the college football playoff, 21.5 points. I think it would be pretty similar, maybe like 18.5, 19.5 if that was Colorado in place of BYU. I don't think there's some bulletproof team, and I don't think being the champ or the best team in the Big 12 is necessarily a high priority kind of crown to wear. Like, I still think there's a lot of exploitable things on that team. And when you look at Kansas, they've been playing pretty well as of recently. Have won 3 of 4, as you mentioned. Their only loss in that stretch was the 2-point rivalry game loss. And they go and knock off an undefeated BYU team last week. They've been playing well after a really slow start to the year. And I think Colorado could be due for a slip-up. So I do like Kansas in that one. And I'm going to go with BYU because I think Arizona State kind of in the same spot where they're a good team and a team that I feel like I've watched. I think they're 8-2 right now. I want to say I've watched 7 or 8 Arizona State games this year. I've watched a weird amount of them, and like because it all goes back to that Thursday night game in like September between Texas State. Ever since then, I've kept like a close eye randomly on both those teams, and great story. You said it with the sanctions and whatnot, but Dillingham basically said like this was a job that he got hired to get fired pretty much, and for them to turn it around this quick has been a really cool story, right up there with kind of Indiana and even look at Colorado, what they've done. But BYU is a team that's played in close games all year. And last week was the first time they lost it. And I'm not sure if you saw it, but it was a pretty funky loss. There was a pooch punt by Jalen Daniels. Yeah, it hits the BYU guy. And that was kind of the turning point in that one. So a few literal bounces go a couple of different ways, and BYU is probably walking out of there with the win. So they're a team that's played in close games all year. I'm going to take them on the road in the upset there. And I'm going to take Kansas at home against Colorado. And if those two scenarios happen, I'm not sure what the scenarios would be for next week for who to make the Big 12 title game, but that would be full-blown all-in chaos, I think.
We're due for a little bit of chaos, for sure. Here's my issue with BYU. They've played in these close games, right? Mm-hmm. And there's no dynamic pull away ability. It's not a word, but you kind of know what I mean here with Kansas and Utah. And look, I know Kansas is significantly improved, and I believe they have to win out to get into a bowl game?
Yeah, 4-6 right now.
So there's a little extra motivation. You can probably sell me a little bit more on Kansas. I haven't been really impressed with BYU. And I think Arizona State, the way they can control the ball, and they went in and bullied K-State. They really did. Yeah. And I think BYU is trending more downward than we think. Mm-hmm. And look, you got to be able to pull yourself out of that mistake. And to me, like it felt like once that mistake happened, the pooch punt you're talking about, because Kansas scored right away. Yep. It felt like BYU didn't have a response. Mm-hmm. And that's my concern going forward is, do they have the response? Is that built in? I don't know if it is. So I think with Arizona State, like you said, there are a few teams every year that you watch so much of in college basketball and college football, and you kind of become attached and you think you have a feel for what they do. Arizona State is that team for me as well. I think they've progressed a lot over the year. And I just think they have the difference maker in Scottsdale. And I think that does make the difference in that game. As much as you could try and sell me on BYU, I'd have a much easier time being sold on Kansas pulling off an upset because of what they've played in the last 3 weeks. But, man, I think it's just BYU's on that slippery slope, and I think they've gotten down. There's like an avalanche coming with them. And
No result will surprise me in either of those matchups. If whatever team wins, I'm not going to be walking out of there shocked at all. I could see him going any other way. It's like the Big 12 is kind of just like flip a coin, basically, and hope for the best in some of these, 2.5, 3-point spread matchups. Some of these spreads are so close. Right. But yeah, we talked about it in the summer. It was going to be the Conference of Chaos, and I don't think any of us said at the end the Final Four is probably coming down to Colorado, BYU, Arizona State, and I guess Iowa State, I think, is the fourth team still kind of mathematically in the mix. But it's not the greatest conference. I think there'll be a quick one and done in the playoff, but it's been a fun conference to keep up with this year with some pretty great stories.
Can I give you the most chaotic result possible?
Let's get it.
Oklahoma State beats Colorado next week.
I have Oklahoma State this week to spoil one of my picks. I'm like praying, give me one Big 12 win.
Gundy's got one of them in him. I hate that I got off the
I've heard
Oklahoma
you say
State
that 6 times this year.
Right, exactly. Oklahoma State they're usually not this bad, and I think they probably should have refurbished the roster a little bit better. The problem with them is traditionally Gundy does get one of these where he is the ultimate chaos maker. They can't stop a damn thing. That's the problem. I think
shot too.
He is shot. Although he's played a little bit better over the last few weeks. But they hung with TCU for just a little bit. They hung with Baylor. And then everything just comes apart in the second half. And which is why the Texas Tech Oklahoma State over 67 is very much circled, bold, and underlined everything because they can't stop anybody. They haven't held an opponent under 38 points since the Utah game. And that's not saying much because Utah's offense hasn't been good. I think Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, it's a lot of points to swallow in the Big 12, but I think that's a pretty much a no-brainer with the way they can't. But I wouldn't be surprised if Oklahoma State is that one team that just pops up out of nowhere. We're looking at all these rivalry games and who can spring the upset Thanksgiving weekend. I know we're looking ahead to that, but we always do this Thanksgiving weekend. Oh, well, what if Georgia Tech? What if Vanderbilt? What if any of these other teams that are kind of little brother in their respective rivalries? What if they do this? Typically, it doesn't happen. Usually, the big brother is big brother in these rivalries. But there's got to be, I think there's one really big upset still brewing somewhere out there, maybe two. Oklahoma State over Colorado would be that super, super big one. I wouldn't bet it, but if you come to me next Friday and say Oklahoma State played Colorado pretty close and Colorado just gave up, I wouldn't be totally stunned at that. But
someone in Stillwater?
No, it's in Boulder, but it's a noon kickoff.
Weird, yeah.
It's one of those weird ones. So maybe they hang around. But again, that's kind of a bit of a stretch for that game. I want to hit on Army and Notre Dame because this is now becoming a potentially fascinating discussion. Army is a 14.5-point dog. It's a primetime game at Yankee Stadium against Notre Dame. Notre Dame's been boat racing everybody, but they also really haven't played anybody in the last few weeks. But now we're running into the situation where we say Tennessee and Indiana, they want Army to beat Notre Dame. Do they, though? Is this the upset they want? Because if Army beats Notre Dame, Army's going up in the rankings. They're shooting up. Yeah. And all of a sudden, Boise State's got a little bit of a sweat going on. Is that the upset that they want? Would they rather just put all their chips into USC? And I believe USC is going to have bowl eligibility on the line in the next 2 weeks. Potentially Lincoln Riley's job, new quarterback in there in Maeva. Maybe that's the point we circle for an upset that at least these teams want. But can Army do it? Is kind of the question I'm kind of roundaboutly asking you here.
I don't think that they can. I think Army. Well, I mean, obviously, excuse me. We'll see in a few weeks against Navy. They're not the same
And we'll
offenses
see them against
anymore.
Tulane as well.
Yeah, they're the not the same triple option offenses of the past. Like there's more different kind of looks incorporated into these offenses now. So you can't say, all right, well, they shut down Navy's offense. They're definitely going to shut down Army. But Notre Dame has just been on an absolute roll. I got it right here. Over this 8-game winning streak, they've outscored their opponents 343 to 85. And I think Notre Dame knows too. Marcus Freeman knows, like, we have the worst loss of anyone in the country in the mix for the playoffs. We have to do everything we can to pretty much kind of ramp up our style points. Like, leave the lasting image of your season that every game since the Northern Illinois game, you basically beat the other team's head in. And Marcus Freeman, best coach in the country against the spread since taking over. I think he is 23, 11, and 2 against the spread, 67.7% of the time he covers since he became the head coach at Notre Dame. So he's a guy that
I would have said James Franklin to answer that question.
I think over that
up
stretch.
there,
yeah, I think over that stretch, it's Kleiman and Franklin in there as well. But he knows that he has to run these scores up, and I think he has the ability to do that. One thing I would just say with the caution of a potential close game, and it's why I liked Army North Texas under a couple weeks ago. North Texas, they wanted to play high 30s, 40s, and just air it out and make it a track meet. Army went back to old school Army, had that 119 play drive, and really just kept the ball on the ground and out of the North Texas offense hands. If they're able to do that and have these slow, methodical drives, make it as ugly as possible, anything is possible in those scenarios. But Notre Dame really didn't blink or bat an eye at Navy. Army similar enough, I think. That sounds like a pretty square analogy in that scenario, but Notre Dame's been rolling, and I think they continue to do that in this one.
Is Army even the best, group of 5 team in their conference?
Your Green Wave.
Yeah. I think Tulane's the much better team and the bigger threat to Boise, but I think the climb has gotten I think the climb happened too late for Tulane to get in there.
Yeah, it's a shame that Tulane, like Oklahoma, wasn't like this week. Because I think there's a scenario that Tulane might have even been favored in that game.
Yeah, no, I actually think that would actually be a really, really strong case, especially where Oklahoma is.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I think you could even have if you had a Louisiana State playoff this year, it would actually be pretty fun.
Yeah,
because the Raging Cajuns are playing pretty well as well. The Sun Belt is all sorts of chaotic because there's a chance that I think any one of 6 teams can still get into the Sun Belt championship game, which is going to make Marshall JMU next week actually is a huge game in the Sun Belt. Real quick, let's get through a few others. Let's talk Ole Miss, Florida real quick. Ole Miss 10.5 point favorite, over under is 55.5. Billy Napier still has a job. How do we even kind of contextualize what Florida's doing? They have to win one game in the next 2 weeks to be bowl eligible, and I think we assume that's going to happen next week against FSU. But can they play spoiler this week?
I think they can. I'm in the camp of, as of right now, I think Ole Miss is probably the second best team in the country. I'm really high on them in the way that they've been looking in recent weeks, coming into form. I think you can make an argument, and it was talked about all offseason, that they might have the best roster in all of college football. And I think they've really started to kind of come into form over these recent past few weeks. So it's not going to surprise me if they go in there and take care of business. But Florida has been playing really well. DJ Lagway is awesome. He's the truth. And I think the guys are just playing really hard for Napier. I mean, that's an LSU team that's in full quit mode, I think, right now on Brian Kelly. You look at Florida kind of the opposite way. It seems like they're playing for their coach. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if they kept that one close. Ole Miss has a lot to play for. Still, are they going to go into this one tight? You said that the Egg Bowl next week, but that one they'll be maybe almost a 3-touchdown favorite, I think, in that
At
game.
least, yeah.
Yeah, but Ole Miss kind of in the scenario of Notre Dame as well. Don't leave the committee with the option of like, oh, well, they weren't really playing that well over the past couple of weeks. Run it up and with the style point. So if you're making me take a bet on that one, I'm not going to bet that game, but I would take Ole Miss minus 10.5. I think Florida can keep it close, but Ole Miss kind of imposes their will over the second half.
I would actually take the under 55.5 there. Ole Miss's defense has been phenomenal over the last few weeks. If a statement win does happen in the like of like a 47-3, I don't think it'd be that big, but something similar. I think that's where it ends up being, where it's Ole Miss wins big, but they also cover, and the game is kind of out of question pretty early on in that game. A few others I just want to kind of touch on real quick. Penn State, 11-point favorite at Minnesota. I don't think we have to worry about Penn State. The middle to lower class of the Big Ten is not great, and Minnesota's already got bowl eligibility wrapped up. I think that's an important thing to note over these next 2 weeks. Bowl eligibility and what it means to not just the power conference teams, but the G5 teams as well. It's a narrative that is 100% real, but Minnesota's got that wrapped up. They lost to Rutgers last week, so the juice is kind of gone there. Their rivalry game next week with Wisconsin is kind of where everything is. I don't think Minnesota can do this, right?
No, Franklin takes care of the inferior opponents. 23-13-1 against the spread as an away favorite. To the matchups, I will say, we just talked about Ole Miss and Florida, but Penn State and Minnesota. It's like if college football wants to give us some chaos, these are the two kind of matchups I'm looking for, because like it's a scenario where, if all things shake right, Minnesota makes that game as ugly as possible. Who knows? You get a bad kick in there or something. That could be a 13-10 Minnesota game. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm going to bet Penn State in this one, but Minnesota and Florida are the two teams I'm looking at that have the role to potentially play the biggest spoiler in college football this weekend. If college football is the college football that we know and love, somebody's going to go down this week that we weren't expecting to add a whole nother loop into the conversation going into rivalry week. But I'll lay it with James Franklin and Penn State with those data and the trends behind them.
If there are chaos agents, they are the two to watch out for. Now, I don't think it'll happen, but they are the two chaos agents. Like you said, bowl eligibility, big thing. The one that circles right, or one stands out right away to me, is UCLA plus the 4.5 against USC. They need to win out. And then that goes into our situation of, well, USC's got something to play for against Notre Dame that you can spin into a narrative there. There'll be plenty of others. I'll look into a lot of them, especially at the G5 level. But Florida, again, is a team that could be desperate. I don't think any of the 4-win teams are really, really in situations that have our attention. I think next week for sure, though, the bowl eligibility is something we can absolutely take advantage of from a betting standpoint. But I wish if you were betting, you kind of wish Minnesota had 5 wins, because then you could be like they're putting all the chips on the table there. But I don't think we can really convince ourselves that is a thing. Real quick, I do want to hit some G5 lines because there's some really, really bad teams in the group of 5, and I've been betting against them pretty much the entire month of November. The one thing I'll look at in the Sun Belt, I have Texas State minus 20 against Georgia State. No reason Georgia State should have been favored last week against Arkansas State.
I thought Georgia State team beat Vandy.
Yeah, that's insane. They're 2-8, and they're not particularly good. Another team that I think might be the worst team in the FBS is Southern Miss. They've been getting the brakes beat off of them pretty regularly over these last few weeks. South Alabama is a 20-point favorite against them. They need to win for a bowl eligibility because they played they're 5-5, but they're also in the mix for the Sun Belt title game, and they play Texas State next week. So that's a game that they have to win anyway against Texas State. But at bare minimum, they have to win this game to get into a bowl. And then, are we trusting Missouri? And this is back to the power conference, but 7.5 points against Mississippi State. That's it.
I thought they looked pretty solid last week
Right.
against South Carolina. Like that was kind of the best they've looked in recent weeks. And South Carolina has been surging too. You can make a argument over the last month that they're one of the best teams in the country. And Missouri took them to the wire. They should have won that game. It took some last second heroics there by South Carolina. But that is a scenario where I would look to bet them. But also you could kind of look at that game as a wind out of the sails type game and a last ditch effort maybe there for Mississippi State to get a conference win.
I think that's the Egg Bowl next week. I think that's where it is. They'll put all their, for lack of a better term, no pun intended here, eggs into the Egg Bowl. I think that's where it is. A rivalry week is one of my favorite weeks because you get football spread out Friday, Saturday. Unfortunately, we don't have the Thursday night game. We do, but it's Memphis and Tulane, not the Egg Bowl. But I'm really looking forward to breaking down that next week with you, and hopefully Mark Henry Jr. is back with us because that has the potential to be a little bit chaotic. And hopefully we do have one or two chaos agents floating around this week that then make next week all sorts of fun as well. But for Ryan Beef Coyle, I am Joe Tansey. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in once again, and good luck on all of your bets on Saturday.